Aesthetaphysicks and the anti-dialectical hyperoccultation of disenchanted representation, hyperstitional esotericism as a cultural accelerationism. Robert Elio Cabral's, University of Amsterdam, Master's Thesis. Plex. A viral rot festers on the precipice of representation. This contagion liquefies the sinewy retentions of unity, violating the limits of ordered thought and centralized identity. Deliquescent discharge oozes from the pores of a once sedentary territory. Racked by plague, representation becomes monstrous, a presentation of an alien alterity which transgresses semiotic stasis. The subversive infestation of reality unfolds across the spectrum of contemporary culture. Postmodern thought has identified the unnecessary and oppressive rigidity of normative social constructs, and as such, philosophers, occultists, artists, magicians, xenomorphs, and sorcerers have provided subversive analyses, theories, methods, and practices for destabilizing control society. Becoming sorcerer. With an accelerated production of and access to information having advanced throughout the 20th century, a rhizomatic systematics of communication networks was consequentially unearthed by post-structural philosophy. Rhizomatic networks became through and as decentralized hyperlinkages, continuously establishing and terminating their connections in a state of non-hierarchical flux. Information in these networks is thus decentralized, relative, and contextual. What information means and furthermore what it does is determined by the operative performance through which the information is conveyed. Any singular performance of information articulation cannot then claim to be the sole and authoritative truth on a matter, as there are numerous other true claims from different perspectives and locations, but a singular claim may still maintain its performative truth relative to the context in which it is operative. A rhizomatic network ontology in this way articulates reality as a complex system substantiated by heterogeneric multiplicity. The reality network is established and whole, but this holism is not as a unification, rather a territory of cut-up and entangled communication in constant nonlinear feedback, moving and shifting to recreate its own fluid boundaries. As a territory of communication, a rhizomatic network can be performed as a field of narration. It is an immanent performance influencing and influenced by itself. Whether this narrative is consistent or inconsistent is determined by control systems and mechanisms, or a lack thereof, employed throughout the rhizome. As control mechanisms, rationality, materialism, and objectivity have been institutionally employed through various information acquisition methodologies. As such, the canonization of these mechanisms across rhizomatic networks has codified a consistent narrative of and as information, enacting a semiotic territorialization of structural and instrumental stability, thus ontologically reified in, through, and as representational reality. The institutional reification machine developed from the material rationality complex is in this way a dominant control system of and for contemporary thought, restricting the territorial fluidity of the rhizomatic reality network by erecting boundaries for representation. To destabilize the consistent and normalized narrative of a controlled and bound semiotic territory, the experimental 20th century scholars Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari articulated a philosophy of sorcerous becomings through which an ordered narrative could be deconstructed and deterritorialized, thus birthing fluid non-representation into increasingly fragmented, schizophrenic narrations. These sorcerous becomings are the multiplicity of experiential states in which lines are blurred between human consciousness and animal awareness, between biopsychic life and the nature of matter itself. Becomings accrue at the vanishing point where history and legend meet, at the twilight horizon where monstrosities of fiction reveal dynamics that translate the most profound facts of biophysical life. A becoming is then a conjuration of the outside from within, the intertextual release of alien information pulsating forth from holes in narrative structure. To become is to be born of unlike relations, not as a kind but as a state, performatively actualizing a potentiality of thought and thus ontologically representing the hitherto non-represented. As such, sorcery is the invocational manifestation of these becomings. The sorcerer conceptually integrates plagues, madness, and swarming contagion into the very fabric of reality, a semiotic infection spread throughout the rhizomatic network, creating and re-engineering an unlimited flow of semiosis by which the singular and ordered narrative gives way to a chaotic and schizophrenic multiplicity of meanings. As an act of ontological fecundity hinged on creative production, the performative invocation and infestation of sorcerous becomings is an aesthetic endeavor. A sorcerer is the philosopher who engineers concepts and the artist who invokes realities. The sorcerer is both of these yet also neither, alienated from a unified identity and thus queering the rigid confines of subjectivity. Philosophy and art now blur beyond distinction, radicalizing the relativity and representational potential of images, words, and performance as a performative instantiation of the very theory put forth. An infiltration of communication has commenced such that the incommunicable outside beyond what is represented is no longer something kept at a distance beyond the threshold of measurement itself. The outside can now possess the social organism, enacting its demonic influence from within. Hyperstitional ontology cybernetics. What constitutes the real, what is, or reality, is a navigation of ontotemporal systematics by which organizational information feeds into, out of, and back into itself, cybernetically conditioning a territory of consistent representation. Here cybernetics can be contextually engaged as communicated information processing within complex systems. It is the performance of adaptational technologies which learn from themselves through feedback loops instantiated by input-output causality. Cybernetics is thus the regulated evolution of a system through itself, though subject to external effect. Locating ontology as a cybernetic system contextualizes the study of being as a descriptive and prescriptive performance, questioning, affirming, and multichronically producing reality as being which is. Ontology is the performative being of a semiotic territory in, as, and through itself. In this way, the production and maintenance of an ontological model both opens up and delineates that which is and can be. The systematic communication between reality and the ontological model generates a feedback loop of and for representation by which representational reality, or the reality of that which is represented in and by the ontological model, controls and conditions the limits thereof. What is present in reality is represented by the ontological model, but what is present in the model is also represented by and as reality. Materiality and its correspondent immateriality are the reality conditions of the dominant ontological model, the primary control system which has territorialized the rhizomatic becoming of reality. What ontologically is and can perform their actuality factually through materiality, while what cannot still paradoxically is, though subjugated to a virtual and immaterial existence, fiction. With the distribution of ontological analysis and development to modern disciplines such as physics, chemistry, biology, and neurology, maintained within the transcendental confines of linear chronology, or history, reality's semiotic flow has been institutionally restricted and organized into a consistent, unified, and ongoing explanatory narrative. Within a rhizomatic network ontology, the operative binaries of fact and fiction, real and unreal, and actual and virtual are upheld insofar as they are systematically maintained by control programs feeding into each other throughout society and culture, but from the rhizomatic perspective in which cybernetic intercausality is an immanent event, the structured binaries are subject to manipulation. A reality which becomes as something multiple and interrelated, though still socioculturally territorialized by binary operations, represents the multiplicity of its network regardless of the representational conditions. What is and what cannot are both represented and performed throughout the rhizome respectively as real things. The difference between these two entangled performances is then their degree of immanent becoming, or their performative relation to the plane of immanence. For material and factual becomings such as matter, art, objects, or gender, the degree of immanence by which they are is actual, whereas those which are deemed immaterial or fictional such as ghosts, demons, and time travel become by a virtual degree of immanence. Here it is of note that the actual is not necessarily restricted to materiality in itself. Gender, though a social construct which is intellectually engaged as an idea which is not physical, is nonetheless actual insofar as it is an idea which is then performed with, by, and through materiality as a specific expression of any one person's continuously developing gender identity. The inverse of this is at play with time travel, though it is theoretically grounded and substantiated by and through physics and thus materiality. Time travel itself, as far as we are aware, performs exclusively as a theoretical idea throughout media and academia, and as such by the virtual degree of culture, be it novels, movies, or theoretical physics articles. The differentiation between actual and virtual reality, between fact and fiction, is thus determined by the degree of performance relative to the representational conditions of control. By engaging, and thus cybernetically conditioning, reality is a rhizomatic performance of and as immanent becoming, the controlled opposition between fact and fiction begins to loosen. Though history in this rhizomatic network ontology functions as a virtual idea, through interplay and feedback history modifies the temporal actualities of time which is no longer itself actual, manipulating an ontotemporal becoming as the past which actually was as such. Given this virtual actual feedback modification complex, fictions thus maintain a performative mode to become real things, hyperstitions cybernetically modifying history and tradition to reveal their own becoming in reality. Hyperstitions are fictions which make themselves real. Though first identified in the 1990s by experimental philosophers composing the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU, at Warwick University, the concept hyperstition in and through itself now plagues the entirety of human culture and ontological temporality. The very act of naming reverse ascribes that which is named. Hyperstition, itself hyperstitional, then actualized its own becoming real the moment it began to infect rhizomatic information networks. Hyperstitionalization is an idea which performs itself through its own explication. It names the very act of ontotemporal reality production that becomes through the act of naming itself. This cyclical practice of descriptive affirmation, the ascriptive enunciation of that which is a transtemporal exercise which takes place simultaneously in the indexical now, the past, and a plotted future. It has a performative narrative which is constantly rewriting itself from the future through the past. In this way, hyperstition transgresses the limits of ontological reification in its identification that the ontological model is as such only through the reflexivity of represented representation cybernetics. The subversive ontotemporal manipulations hyperstitions perform operate from and as creative becomings. In this way hyperstitionalization is an operation of applied aesthetics, a semiotic insurgency which rewrites dominant narratives. Hyperstition is sorcery, and its aesthetic performance bleeds into cultural networks, functioning as a postmodern art theory and praxis for multitemporal reality engineering. Accelerationism, teleology of capital time modulations. The material rational control system territorializing rhizomatic becoming as an ontological model has industrialized reality through politico-cultural economic feedback. As a performative system, the codified narrative conditioning representational reality has evolved over time, responding to onto-epistemic problems which result from former problem solutions employed throughout the socio-cultural information matrix. These onto-epistemic problems are situated, contextual, and embodied, cracks, holes, and voids in the immanent whole of the narrative construct. It is up to those performing within and as the semiotic field of representation to address these problems, either through the paranoid perpetuation of the represented territory, or by schizophrenic deterritorializations conjuring the non-represented alien from within. Material rationality and empirical objectivity have been cybernetically reified by and as the dominant control system through the teleonomic development of institutionalized problem-solving. The intellectual enlightenment germinated in the 18th century commenced a semiotic infestation of reality, effectuating positive feedback loops for its own contagion. An implementation of scientific solutions to the representational problems of reality catalyzed the need for scientific methodology to then respond to the problems created by the former scientific solutions. solving the problems and answering the questions faced by material rationality and empirical objectivity required rationality and empirical materialist methods, thus reifying the model through itself, delving deeper and deeper into an explanation of an explanation, and performatively modeling a performance of a model. Through and by the dialectical experimentation of empirical materiality, representation is then institutionally reified on a linear axiom, developing itself horizontally and vertically within the fixed territory charted by the science institution rather than exploring the outside and expanding the map through the unknown. It is in this way that the secularization of semiosis has evolved a disenchanted ontology, unwriting the causal authority of religious and occult codifications performing throughout representation prior to the Enlightenment. Scientific representation furthermore limits semiotic flow through its engagement with technoscientific commodification. The causal interplay of materiality and science through technological development feeds into and is correspondently fed by capitalism. Scientific developments are progressed by new technology, and new technology is made possible through the progression of scientific developments. Technology is a commodity and science is an industry, their entanglements reverberating epistemically, ontologically, and multitemporally across rhizomatic becomings. The technoscientific reification of material rationalism through a filter of productive commodification has commodified representation itself, conditioning a reality represented by and through objects with productive and monetary values. This object-commodity codification has seeped throughout the socio-cultural matrix, infecting not just ontological, epistemic, and technological navigations, but aesthetics, affective biopsychic life, and time itself. Creative imaginings of the future have been restricted and conditioned by the plague of capital, performing cross-culturally as the futures industry. This futures industry is the performance of semiotic territorializations for time yet to come. It is a decentralized swarm of consumption by which creative media depicting future technology, people, civilization, and timelines maintain an oracular function, transmitting messages from a possible future toward which society may advance. These oracular transmissions enact presentational pre-representations, or pre-presentations, of temporal flow, onto aesthetic semiotic performances by which the futures industry retrochronically conditions the technoscientific advancement of representational becomings, directing or diverting narrative developments. The transmissions from the futures industry feed technoscientific commodity production and simultaneously the ontological paranoia maintaining the material capital network of the dominant reality program. The pre-presentational onto aesthetics of the futures industry thus circulate lines of flight by which the development of society may begin to pick up speed and mobilize an expansion of the representational territory. For an anthropocentric technoscientific territory, this enacts the acquisition of new commodities of utility and recreation whose use will be primarily accessible, at least initially, to the privileged minority of the affluent, and whose production will monetarily benefit large corporations. For socio-cultural narratives, society receives messages of post-eras, such as performances of post-human subjects or post-capitalism civilizations. Post-human representations within the futures industry maintain the capacity to introduce new ways of being as embodied subjects and to question binaries and oppressive categorizations of what it means to be human, such as human and nature, race, gender, sex, or human and machine, yet the post-human can also be ignored by the futures industry, reifying the rigidity of contemporary codifications within a technologically advanced society. A culture in which technology has advanced both the relative quality and functionality of life and yet heterosexual gender norms, hypermasculinity, and institutional racism still structure and condition social being. Post-capitalism representations then depict how and if humanity can exit capitalism. The narratives which infest the pre-presentational networks of post-capitalism performance have come to manifest dystopian or hyper-fascist futures. The pre-presentation of a successful exit from capitalism has lost traction and momentum as utopic representation fades further into the obscurity of non-representation. with an entangled complex of technoscientific prosperity juxtaposed against dystopian horror narratives as the cost of capitalism's exit. The future's industry functions to maintain the socio-political inevitability of the material capitalism's perdurance. It encourages us to place our material investment in only a narrow range of futures that are produced by corporations as the chief mechanism by which we are encouraged effectively to invest in the possibilities of capitalism. The future is something to be survived, and maintaining the dominant control system is the means to and only option for survival. Rather than succumb to the fixed semiotic flow conditioned by the technoscientific future's feedback within and through the performativity of the dominant ontological model, multitemporal sorcery has the capacity to rewrite and invoke narratives by and with history's actualizing capacity for onto aesthetic flow. The multitemporal ramifications of hyperstition and hyperstitionalization identify the possibility of sending ideas through time, thus manipulating the immanent becoming of history as a territorial narrative within and as a rhizomatic network. Hyperstitions travel transtemporally throughout the virtual matrix of history, transmitting messages from the future through the past and establishing cybernetic feedback by which virtual realities become actually real. A hyperstition which becomes virtually in the past will then be reified in, through, and as history, cybernetically actualizing its performative presence within the contemporary sociocultural matrix. Furthermore, hyperstitions with a virulent infection rate, those ideas which perform and spread in and as a multiplicity themselves, maintain the deterritorializing function of plotting a trajectory into a future ulterior to the controlled developments of the ontological model conditioning and conditioned by technoscientific capitalist culture. The theory of time by which hyperstitions rhizomatically operate can be identified as accelerationism. Another theory manifest through the CCRU, accelerationism in the first 2 decades of the 21st century has already been employed for political ends, establishing communications with post-human futures aligned with the socio-political semiotics of both left and far-right value narratives. Abstracted from its performative operations, accelerationism theoretically performs the idea that time, as a concept reflexively employed within time itself, territorializes temporality, and thus itself as time, as a transcendental entity. The performative presence of this transcendental entity located in an immanent network of rhizomatic becoming allows for effective onto-temporal manipulations. Ideas can be accelerated through the past from lost futures virtually haunting history. Contemporary ideas can be collapsed into positive feedback loops accelerating their becoming as a future construct. Ideas which are in no way represented can even manifest in reality and spread their presentational actuality by a hybridization of the former two accelerationist modes, cybernetically representing the alien semiotics of and as a maddening unknown. Accelerationist theory locates the very becoming of futures, plotting trajectories which deterritorialize the unopposed narrative constraints maintained by the fixed semiosis of the technoscientific ontological model commodifying futures industry. By manipulating history through the cybernetic acceleration of hyperstitions, accelerationists deterritorialize the controlled narrative of time and manipulate its temporalized trajectory rather than propagate the semiotic rigidity of the performance which at present holds the stage. Throughout the territorialized whole which prescribes and describes the semiotic flow of representation, there are necessarily cracks and holes, voids of narrative lapse, breakage, and inconsistency by which fictions may infiltrate history and make themselves real. Identified above as the onto epistemic problems whose solutions institutionally evolve representational reality, holes are also established onto aesthetically through the caustic noise of hauntological feedback and sorcery. Hauntological holes become through the death of a timeline, failures of futures and the unengaged presence of effective concepts or systems which then haunt culture as virtual specters. Holes which become through sorcerous intervention are performative void manifestations, rifts ripped open through the retrochronic recalibrations of invocational transmissions, viral cells conjured forth through creative acts unstrategically located where their infection rates will thrive. Identifying the presence of a hole then initiates a complex by which the holes must be filled, or rather developed into the dominant narrative. The relationship between whole and void, their whole complex, thus establishes input locations for both the hyper and intertextual integration of rejected, non-actualized, and virtual ideas into narrative flow. Embedded in the virtual actual feedback modification complex of historicization, insurgent fictions are hypercamouflaged within the performance of history. With an overlap and coincidence between fiction and fact, hyperstitions gain speed such that their actual historical presence may then be operated as and through pre-presentational onto aesthetics. This anti-dialectical methodology negates the linear notion of progress by which new elements are let into the semiotic flow of representations on the condition that they can be afforded by society. It is not the proposition of parallel, oppositional, and antithetical semiotics, but the creative invocation of an unseen semiotics into representation which then infects the onto aesthetic network. Accelerationism does not simply produce idealized or utopian futures as creative media performances, nor does it exclusively locate explicitly post-capitalist futures. Through anti-dialectic insurgency, accelerationist theory actualizes socio-cultural components and flows. These vector components which are then historically present can thus function to produce lines of flight outside of and yet still operating effectively within the technoscientific commodification industry of material capitalism. With this theory in play, social culture gains a tool to contrast the inevitability of reified representation. What is post both human and capitalism is no longer restricted to the authority of capital development. What is useful, valuable, or exploitable to the dominant system is no longer the basis of temporal flow. Accelerationism discursively operates as a manifestation of performance philosophy. It is an act of sorcery by which the theory practices itself through and by its own conceptual mappings and navigations. This entangled assemblage of theory, method, and practice gives way to an active historicism, performative and effective, operating history as an aesthetic field. A postmodern approach to history does not simplify time to a semiotic flow of truth and authorities, rather it complexifies the becoming of time, fragmenting narratives and liberating truth from material rational reification loops and singularities. While this schizo-historical performativity maintains an iconoclastic function, it does not do so through an abandonment of historical records, dates, research, documents, or information. An active and aesthetic history simply operates history beyond the limits of linear chronology, identifying the multiplicities of rhizomatic becoming and thus splicing, cutting, and folding fluid channels into each other and themselves to manifest neo-extant perspectives. The past and the future are entities which are present now, and their creative expansion deterritorializes narrative stasis, revealing old from new, messages from the future through the past. A cultural esotericism. In the same vein as post-structural experimental philosophy, 20th-century occultism developed into and as theories and methods for infectious reality manipulation. Out of the epoch of Victorian esotericism and through the digital matrix of 1990s cyberspace, occult currents and their cultural receptions have radically modified themselves again and again, respawning a disenchanted magic which maintains the subversive capacity to transgress the limits of an instrumentalized representational ontology. Disenchanted magic can be understood broadly as magical theories and praxis which have developed such that their functional mechanics are not outright inconsistent with the dominant ontological control system of objective material rationality. The disenchanted ontology demarcates a secularized semiotic territory within which religious codifications as a reality narrative are no longer afforded causal authority. Psychology, affect theory, and complex systems dynamics are among the operative ontological components utilized by contemporary magicians to manipulate reified representation from within, through a performative overlap and integration with occult semiotics. Developing from the psycho-affective aestheticization of ritual magic articulated by and through Aleister Crowley, magic became as the experimental integration of will, thought, and intention into and as reality itself. The magician who performs in a ritual inputs meaning into reality, effectuating feedback loops and noise within the networked hyperlinkages which then perform as observable representation. Modulating this logic, computer programming and the digital model of cyberspace are utilized by contemporary magicians to legitimize and actualize their practice ontologically. Just as a programmer writes a code which will semiotically manifest in, as, by, and throughout the Internet, a magician, effectively embedded in the communicative matrix of a materialist territory, can encode information into and as representational reality. This cyclical undifferentiation of code and program by which the program can rewrite the code is a fracturing of narrative consistency throughout reality. It is a schizophrenic turn by which semiotic universality gives way to a plurality of contextualized and immanent performative actualizations. Again, the aesthetic aspect of reality manipulation is utilized. The infestation of will into the controlled system of material causality is a creative endeavor. Art and occultism have queered their boundaries, utilizing image creation, performative theatricality, sonic fragmentation, and narrative alterations to effectuate onto temporal aestheticizations of reality. Through networked communication channels, the once hidden world of occult orders, traditions, and philosophies has become a cultural component, cut up and distributed as a variety of performative discursivities. This network dissemination has made occult culture, or rather a culture, an ordinary facet of Unda's cultural communication hypercamouflaged within the semiotic territories of information and entertainment. Here ordinary does not necessarily mean normalized as a belief, rather identifying accessibility and presence. Cultural ideas in television, film, and music do not maintain the same presence nor the depth of content as scholarly discourse on esoteric topics and currents, and none of the former hold the same socio-political position and authority as scientific material rational discourse. Nonetheless, a culture performs as and within both popular and academic culture, and furthermore as and within artistic, spiritual, and socio-political culture. Due to this, a culture has been institutionally integrated into the rhizomatic network of representation, a subversive swarm disguised throughout and as reified reality elements. Privy to the postmodern integration of a culture into representational semiotic territories, individuals actualizing the hybridization of artist and magician have utilized occult art to engineer social modifications. This experimental occulture becomes as esotericism, the careful combination of art, sigillization, and the occult to bring about cultural change. The invocational naming of esotericism is credited to the temple of psychic youth, Topi, industrial pagans in the 1980s prowling the underbelly of society as disaffected outsiders, experimenting with networked chaos and manufacturing territorial fragmentations. Under the guise of a fan club for experimental electronic group Psychic TV, Topi circulated chaos magic throughout cultural networks. Topi was a paramilitary occult order that was secreted within something that seemed enough part of popular culture for it not to appear to be a threat immediately. This incursion of the outside from within became as effective manipulations of social norms through the hyperoccultation of artistic output, subversive representations of gender, and the cut-up redistribution of time itself. Esotericism both as an idea and a practice maintains a deterritorializing function. The non-representational outside is unleashed within reality as a challenge to not only social codification, but the normalized ontological boundaries of causality. As disenchanted magic, esoterist action qua aesthetic performativity rhizomatically actualizes the potentialities of thought. A differentiation between real and unreal, fact and fiction is systematically undermined as sorcerous esotericism seethes the intensive operative of horror from within. Aesthetaphysical reflexivity, a cultural accelerationism and hyperstitional esotericism. Entrenched in a semiotic field of technoscientific materiality, representational becoming has been restricted to something physical, rational, and instrumental. The enchanted reality matrix has been solved away through the institutional implementation of scientific objectivism and is thus no longer an ontological problem throughout reality's dominant narrative construct. Ontological influences from religion, spirituality, occult forces, or any other esoteric operations of representational performance have been stripped of causal authority, disenchanting becoming and enacting a secular onto-temporal reality network. Furthermore, any amendment to the dominant control system such as to reintegrate an enchanted model of representation then stands contrary both to the cybernetic reification system and the rational ideology of the material physical ontological system. As a solution to the rigid performativity of representational reality, a reintegration of an enchanted semiotics qua re-enchantment functions as a reaction to disenchantment, a parallel semiotic flow couched entirely in oppositional terms. This reactionary model necessitates a linear process by which an enchanted semiotics is let into the socio-cultural flow of technomateriality through ontological negotiations, gaining effective traction moving forward. Given the technoscientific commodification industry of material capitalism, the institutional recodification of enchantment seems unlikely, unrealistic, and unaffordable, in a network both founded, and funded, upon the cybernetic teleonomy of the scientific model as objective truth, questioning the authority of the systems of control by which said model is propagated undermines the holistic efficacy of the narrative territory. The problem of the ontological system enacted by the Enlightenment and perpetuated cybernetically through its application has thus become the lack of metacritical engagement of the system in and by itself. Though science is a control system of experimental checks and balances to ensure objective validity, the absence of a metacomponent for and within science itself has conditioned an autonomous reflexivity propagated as a linear vector. The territorialized reality network only receives feedback from within itself, as the feedback mechanisms have been designed and designated by and through the network itself. In light of this, developmental deterritorializations of the dominant narrative territory cannot be employed as oppositional programs. Non-representation beyond the limits of the semiotic field will remain as the outside as long as the limit is determined not by what it is not, but what it can be. That which is outside the control system of science is non-scientific, and therefore cannot be validated as objectively true and real phenomenon and thus integrated moving forward. The practice of disenchanted magic developed throughout the 20th century identifies localized subversive performances of onto-temporal becoming which manifest within the confines or codified representation. Having adapted their practice to the constraints of materialist systematics, postmodern magicians effectuate aesthetic manipulations of reality through an insurgent embrace of the dominant narrative rather than through an antithetical rejection of the semiotic territory. Furthermore, the invocation of the concept esotericism has weaponized the subversive insurgency of disenchanted magic, locating a means to spread magic's effective contagion throughout a cultural networks. This plague of the outside manifesting within identifies the groundwork for a steganographic occupation of representation, an alternative to re-enchantment which accentuates and utilizes the consistency of aesthetic performance across ontology, physics, magic, philosophy, technology, and the entire matrix of socio-cultural becoming. Interspliced with the sorcery of postmodern philosophy, the network mechanics of esoterist action maintain the capacity to hijack the virtual actual feedback modification complex of history and hyperstitionalize an ontological virus within and throughout the rhizomatic becoming of multitemporal representation. This virus will maintain a deterritorializing function for the outside from within, establishing tractions for non-represented reality components to aesthetically become as effective vectors, corroborating a cultural lines of flight both throughout and as a plurality of reality narratives. Performing as an overlap between fiction and fact, imic and itic, art and scholarship, the infectious plague known as aesthetaphysicks will seethe throughout academia and socio-cultural becoming, a theory and practice which has been cast back through history from the future, actualizing its infectious virulence into present academia. Aesthetaphysics performs as an experimental complex systems theory of and as onto-temporal network aesthetics, a philosophy of, for, and from hyperstition, a culture, and accelerationism, the creative manipulation of time, reality, culture, history, and society as art by artistic means. The identification of, and as such performance of representation as, a network of aesthetic onto-temporality gives way to the rhizomatic becoming of reality through a schizo-fragmented flow of unlimited semiosis. By a networked aestheticization of reality, the systems which codify and perform a representation will be identified as creative programs, actualizing their artistic capacity and effectuating non-traditional spaces for experimentation across the socio-cultural information matrix, thus conditioning an anonymous reflexivity propagated by nonlinear vector multiplicities. With aesthetaphysics comes a scholarly grounding for magic, esoteric exploration into the occult dimensions of the represented and the non-representational through the thinking and theory of postmodernism. Through the pursuit of this aesthetaphysical theory, ritual practices, ideas, and potentials from distant historical periods identified as occult, esoteric, or spiritual can be reimagined as aesthetic modes and methods of and for hyperstitionalization, and from such, the aesthetic re-engineering of reality. Aesthetaphysics gives way to and is the very practice and performance of a cultural accelerationism. As a social theory, accelerationism manipulates our present by means of pre-presentational futures through a hyperstitionalized past. By means of a cultural content, aesthetaphysics will engage and contribute to the contemporary political discourse surrounding and founded upon accelerationism by opening a space for magic as art as philosophy to posit futures and people to come effectively consistent with contemporary feminist, post-colonial, and queer theory. Aesthetaphysics as a means of a cultural accelerationism also brings an up-to-date knowledge of Western esotericism and disenchantment discourse into accelerationist and contemporary philosophical discourse, deterritorializing the academic rut of re-enchantment theory and instead giving way to a method and mode for a hyperoccultation of representational reality. It is of note that aesthetaphysics is not an anti-scientific theory. Science is not something useless to be rejected, nor can its presence be abstracted from any plausible futures vector. The problem presented by and through the strict and authoritative scientific worldview is its conservative stasis by which non-representation is excluded and value-based utility, located by heteronormative performativity, is the standard for presentational development. Unlike re-enchantment discourse, hyperoccultation is not something parallel to a disenchanted reality narrative which then must be negotiated into being through a reactionary politics. The performance of hyperoccultation through aesthetaphysical theory will simply open spaces within and around science and the dominant control programs, theoretically allowing for inter- and interdisciplinary experimentation, and furthermore rational foundations for non-material representation, effect, and becoming. While the system, project, and practice of aesthetaphysics draws heavily from a distorted conceptualization of historical materials as a vector for schizo-historical disorientation, the proposed methodology functions through a combination of meta-analysis, rhizomatic discourse analysis, and whole complex. The meta-analytic aspect of this methodology allows for the engagement of content across large chunks of research material, topics, or fields and gives way to a synthesis of said informational content. The rhizomatic discourse analysis component also engages large amounts of content, but rather than focusing on a synthesis of information it both engages and produces performative hypertextuality between works, ideas, thinkers, and time periods in and as a nonlinear and constantly evolving rhizome of interconnectivities. The application of a rhizomatic discourse analysis brings into the research complex diverse lenses such as semiotics, historiography, phenomenology, and schizoanalysis without being limited to any one rigid system or its epistemic baggage. Finally, whole complex is the relationship between solid and void within dynamic networks. What this means is that in a solid there are voids, holes, pockets, or more simply inconsistencies. In operating whole complex qua methodology, it is not a matter of engaging these holes as a matter of critique, but rather utilizing said holes in order to let the solid further develop in itself. This allows for the whole to breathe and grow into something new but the same, and is as much a creative endeavor as a scholarly practice. By operating these three methodologies within one cut-up method, academic research which simultaneously engages and redevelops at a textual, theoretical, social, historical, and aesthetic level performs as an interdisciplinary and postmodern scholarly praxis. Utilizing the above research program, This thesis will investigate and understand 20th century occultism by and as postmodern philosophical theory in order to demonstrate both the intellectual and practical relevance of occultural praxis within contemporary social, philosophical, and aesthetic discourse. The following investigation will thus be executed by pitching and mapping aesthetaphysical theory back and through 20th century occult currents. This retroactive historical incursion functions both to manifest and accelerate a schizophrenic and aesthetic tradition of ontotemporal hyperstitionalization which will give way to the very development of the methods by which aesthetaphysics will and has hyperstitionalized its own actual becoming. Rather than demonstrate causal influences and intentional applications between historical actors and periods, this work will perform historiography, philosophy, art theory, and occultism in a decentralized flux, giving way to a discursive alienation and hypertextual feedback loops. Decentralized from their conditioned disciplinary territories, the reality production brought upon through the sorcerous concept engineering of postmodern philosophy will feed into the practical reality reordering practiced and articulated by and through 20th century magic. This feedback then serves to blur the distinction between magic and philosophy, performing philosophy as magic as philosophy, and becoming as a hyperstitional esotericism, rhizomatically infecting academic information networks. The proposed thesis is not making an argument about any historical relationship between philosophy and occultism, but rather conducting an experiment which will explore the very unlimits of thought each discourse opens in, through, and as each other. This experiment is thus in itself modeled utilizing the theory it is putting forward, not a hypothesis, test, and a conclusion, but an aesthetic engagement deterritorializing the semiotic codifications of material rationalist idea dissipation by means of a creative aesthetic logic becoming through itself. As such, the following does not detail an essentialist or universalist position, but a reflexive demonstration of the very theory under analysis, an articulation of that which is being articulated. This schizo-historical experimentality is thus the theory and the topic of the work at hand, a performative didacticism as reverse ascriptive discourse infestation. Having established a performative conceptual network of socio-cultural and onto aesthetic contextualization in the present section plex, the following section time circuit will detail a schizo-historical tradition of and for aesthetaphysics, networked multitemporally across chaos magic, the Church of Satan, the Temple of Psychic Youth, and the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. From this, the final section warp will then detail practical applications of aesthetaphysical theory in contemporary art and scholarship, demarcating aesthetaphysics efficacy as a pre-presentational post-vector for and as a cultural accelerationism. The holistic becoming of this work, both as an object and a performance, will function to reintegrate the superfluous research conducted across Western esotericism into postmodern academic and artistic spaces. By performing within and across contemporary post-structural discourses, aesthetaphysics as a cultural accelerationism will demonstrate a deterritorialization of the religio-historical narratives conditioning the development of Western esotericism, opening the space for a creative re-engagement and propagation of the information network's semiotic flow. Time circuit. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. Chaos reigns. A magical tradition can be understood as a semiotic territory within which magicians learn to interpret their experiences. Throughout this territory, systematic narratives propagate the efficacy conditions by which the magical workings of a group or individual function. These narratives perform a belief system as and for a model of cybernetic participation which autocatalyzes the actual becoming of magical effect. Belief in a codified system subjectively maps the territory within and by which the ritual and practices of that system function, and by mapping the territory the system is then given a creative space in which to observably perform. Invoked as a viral swarm, chaos magic is not a belief system in itself but an untradition of iconoclastic deterritorializations, a methodological cross-utilization of multiple tradition systems subjectively folded and cut into each other. The functionality of chaos magical praxis thus becomes by performative belief, or metaprogramming, and the hyperstitionalized ontological feedback complex of observed efficacy actualizations. Chaos magic in this way engages the postmodern practice of hypertextual systems communications, a rhizomatic networking of autonomous narratives so as to perform a decentralized flow of non-represented semiotic becoming. As an untradition, chaos magic is then spread through and as a discourse of innovative subversions, a paradoxical continuity of discontinuity entangled by a complex of iconoclastic perennialism. 20th century occultism performs magic as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. With this operative magical mode, rather than subscribing to the limited codifications of a single tradition's effectuation narrative, a chaos magician can pick and choose theory, rituals, aesthetic elements, or even entire systems, actual or virtual, by which to creatively manifest a magical vector as and for their will. The efficacy of the performative chaos system is then hinged upon the magician's belief that it will function. Magical accomplishments become by the subjective belief that what one is doing is and will produce effective noise within and across representation, and from such said effect is something empirically observable. Through an active application of whole complex, a chaos magician establishes a systematized logic for how and why their magic will work, thus conditioning a semiotic territory within which their will may spread. Transgressing the historical authorities which legitimize a magical system's authenticity, a chaos magician has only to convince themselves that what they are doing makes sense and as such will function, establishing an aestheticological territory to consequently observe manifestations of their will in the world. Becoming in a disenchanted reality matrix of material physicality, the subjective legitimization of magical praxis is conditionally territorialized by the rigid codifications of scientific theory, because the magician performs within a controlled field of representation. The manifestation of will is also to some degree contextualized by semiotic codifications. For the chaos magician to legitimize and thus believe in their magic's functionality, their magical vector must infest representation as an incursion of the outside from within. As legitimizing narratives to hypercamouflage magical effect, chaos magicians have adopted and adapted scientific theories for vector propagation. By the mathematical articulation of chaos theory, chaos is performed through fluctuations of complex systems' initial states which then gain traction and accelerate large-scale evolutionary changes across a system's network. The cybernetic network mechanics of chaos theory thus establish a dynamic logic by which chaos magic can then utilize additional complex network theories such as neuroscience, quantum physics, or even internet cybercommunications to legitimize the functionality of a large variety of magical intentionality. Having legitimized belief in the ontological propagation of a given chaos magical system, it is then a matter of identifying the causal efficacy of a magical vector. Through the observational tracking of will by and within representation, the chaos magician establishes cybernetic feedback loops between their effective magical working and ontological effectuations of said work. Prior to the chaos ritual, a magician's will exists by a virtual degree of immanence, but through the multitemporal cybernetics of hyperstitionalization, said will becomes observable because it has been successfully invoked magically, and the magical invocation will be successful because the will becomes observable. Observation here is another performance of whole complex. The results of chaos magic need not perform outright as an explicit narrative tracing the very conditions of the magician's will. Instead, the observational mapping of temporal flow functions to identify both nuanced and caustic performances of magical effects by and through a multiplicity of subtle interactions. As a magician's will begins to manifest in observable ways, said will integrates actualization traction through the future into the past to become a fiction which has then made itself real. Observational cybernetics of and as belief result circuity are the cultural legacy of 20th century magician and aesthetaphysical theorist Aleister Crowley. The appeal to empirical methods as a mode of magical actualization performs the scientific outlook and model as an aestheticized psychomateriality complex, queering the ontological causality reified within and as the representational territorialization of disenchanted material reality. While Aleister Crowley's theory provides foundational traction for the efficacy dimension of chaos magic through the aesthetic hyperoccultation of science, it is from 20th-century artist and occultist Austin Osman Spare that visual art becomes as an effective onto aesthetic sigil magic utilized across chaos magical discourse. Sigils perform the semiotic codification of will through and as the material manifestation of non-representational designs. As an aesthetic invocation of narrative effectuation, the artist as magician encrypts their will vector as and by an abstract image. The encryption praxis revealed by Austin Osman Spare utilizes deterritorializations of the semio-linguistic system of the written word such that a statement of will is alienated from the codifications of language and may cybernetically manifest through an unformed potentiality of onto aesthetic becoming. In this encryption process, the magician mobilizes their will as a line of flight through a linguistic statement, or sentence. This statement is then cut up, disposing of its vowels and any double letters. With the remaining letters a conglomerate symbol is composed as an abstract and non-representational design, concealing any presence of the former normative symbols and hypertextualized will statement. This ritualistic becoming of non-representation opens a presentational rift by which a triangulated circuitry is established between the aesthetaphysical magician, the performative art object, and representational reality. For Spare, the production of a sigil was preceded by the burning of the sigil into the subconscious. Through a process of psychological deterritorialization brought upon through ecstatic trance states, the artist-magician deconditions belief and the mechanistic limitations of representational self and reality while focusing on their magical sigil. By simultaneously deconstructing the codified narratives of identity and reality, the then discontinuous magician is networked with and as the rhizomatic multiplicity or representation, burning their will into the hypersynapses of becoming. The absence or vacuity of belief thus functions to infest representation as non-representation, propagating alien consciousness and creative effect with and as the unformed potential of reality. With their will then spliced into the schizophrenic unfolding of representative becoming, Austin Osman Spare expresses that the magician may do away with or forget their produced sigil, but for chaos magic, the sigil may be further utilized as an effective plague vector. Performing as a material hyperlink connecting magician, art, and reality, the sigil qua work of art may establish psycho-acceleratory feedback across socio-cultural flow. By invoking and thus manifesting the sigilization of will correspondent to group or social effectuation, a material sigil, not necessarily limited to the specific anti-linguistic model linked to Spare, circulates encrypted potentiality, its very engagement uncoding system limitations and opening space for creative reality engineering and hyperstitional esotericism. A chaos magician's schizophrenic fluctuation between metaprogramming and the vacuity of belief operates a system of unbelief by which the creative potentiality of reality can be actively engaged, manipulated, and infected. Anarchy and subversion swarm across chaos discourse, spreading an onto aesthetic methodology of deterritorialization praxis through cultural networks to criticize and combat oppressive power structures and conservative semiosis. The iconoclastic non-representation propagated by chaos magic is furthermore located throughout its own schizo-historical development, maintaining its untradition of and by iconoclastic perennialism. Though chaos magic can be historically traced through Aleister Crowley, Austin Osman Spare, Robert Anton Wilson, Peter J. Carroll, and Ray Sherwin, among others, their authorities within the magical discourse dynamic are limited to utilization, not formal structuring. The foundational stage of and for chaos magic is thus an encouragement of adaptational innovation and creativity, the reprogramming of authority systems through an appeal to their representational legitimacy. Perennialism communicates the idea that an eternal truth has been and is performatively represented throughout time within varying periods, cultures, and traditions. Embedded within the semiotic territory mapped by a tradition system then is the truth which flows across and beyond time, through the past and into the future. Given the flow of truth through multiple systematic narratives, a tradition territory itself is thus identified as a construction within which truth may be located. As such, perennialism becomes an effective tool for accelerating unbelief systems, a democratic framework that includes a vast array of historical or cultural elements in which the current or latest instance of knowledge is just as valid as the oldest. Within the dynamics of chaos magic, the truth which perdures is the relative contextualization of truth's performative actualization. It is not an objective, ageless, and eternal truth, but rather the effective notion that truth becomes if engaged as such. From this, a chaos magician's appeal to magical tradition hacks the semiotic territory and effectuation vectors by which truth is being progressed in a given historical system, establishing rhizomatic communication channels by which to network a creative and innovative redevelopment of said tradition's operation of perennial knowledge. In this way, chaos magic encourages innovation and creativity as products of the dynamic that exists between conceptions of perennialism, constructed religions of magic, and the call to iconoclasm. As a mode of macro-legitimization, chaos magic navigates iconoclasm as an interpretation of perennial continuity emphasizing change. Iconoclasm is the driving principle of this perennialism since the established, conventional, or dogmatic must be challenged or even destroyed to produce the next instance of knowledge or wisdom. Iconoclastic perennialism thus functions both to actualize feedback between the historical authority of traditional magic systems and chaos magic, and also to maintain the legitimacy of chaos magic discourse across its schizophrenic unboundaries. Iconoclasm as the destruction of images and traditions, or rather deterritorializations of stagnant semiotic narratives, is then operated as an insurgent vector for non-representational becomings. By infecting historical narratives, chaos magic introduces the non-representational, the outside within pre-established historico-representational flow, and through the appeal to the chaos magic's untradition, a localized manipulation of tradition is not performed as an enigmatic unfolding within the representational network, but is instead hyperlinked to and as the chaos magic swarm. In this way, the creative fictions of new magical theories and practice are actualized hyperstitionally as real dynamics, then further integrated with the disenchanted semiotic narrative, legitimizing their representational performance as a becoming magic. Through performative belief system actualization, the reality mechanics of chaos magic accelerate a cultural content in and as hyperstitions which integrate their actuality by ascriptive becoming. As a contemporary performative component, the accelerated accultural content is then cross-networked with scientific and psychosociocultural theory to not only legitimize its application but propagate its efficacy. Operating a discourse from which all instances of its untradition are valid opens up a creative space by which an unlimited flow of semiosis may be maintained through consciousness and re-territorialization. For contemporary magicians, artists, and sorcerers apt to accelerate esoterist infiltrations of the cultural becomings throughout rhizomatic temporality, chaos magic maintains the capacity for the effective hyperoccultation of the technoscientific material rational reality program. As a performance of aesthetaphysical theory, chaos magic undermines the monopolism of belief territorializing semiotic flow, effectuating lines of flight for alternate future trajectories. Theater of the Black Plague, Mass. The plague takes images that are dormant, a latent disorder, and suddenly extends them into the most extreme gestures. The theater also takes gestures and pushes them as far as they will go. Like the plague, it reforges the chain between what is and what is not, between the virtuality of the possible and what already exists in materialized nature. It recovers the notion of symbols and archetypes which act like silent blows, rests, leaps of the heart, summons of the lymph, inflammatory images thrust into our abruptly weakened heads. The theater restores us all our dormant conflicts and all their powers and gives these powers names we hail as symbols, and behold, before our eyes is fought a battle of symbols, one charging against another in an impossible melee, for there can be theater only from the moment when the impossible really begins and when the poetry which occurs on the stage sustains and superheats the realized symbols. Theater maintains the sorceress' capacity for incantation, a presentational calling forth by which virtuality is actualized by the feedback of material enactment. Already by the 1930s, French thinker, dramatist, and iconoclast Antonin Artaud cried out against the conservative stasis restricting theatre's incantational potential. The theatre had been reduced to an abstract chamber for the reification of representational normality, propagating the narrative territory of the psychologized character and linear continuity. Artaud sought to liberate the magical potentials of theatre, of language, form, and space, and inaugurate a theatre of anarchy, chaos, and alchemy, a theatre of cruelty, not as a mirror but a portal, a hole by which to pull forth the outside and effectively spread its schizophrenic potentials. The magic of theatre seethes from an effective poetry of space, the physical networking of that which can be materially expressed for the senses and unleashed as an active presence, a becoming real of the stage such that the stage is reality and reality is the stage. This becoming real is the territorialization carried out by the mise-en-scene, the performative components of and as the reality stage by which the effective network begins to swarm. As an active presence, the theatricized mise-en-scene conditions and codifies space, effectuating a subversive semiotic territory within the controlled representations of the dominant control narrative. This subversive territory, the liminal void embedded in the representational reality, functions to actualize fictions as a plague infests a body, a communicative delirium of belief through fascination, abjection, ecstasy, and horror. To subvert the codification loops of modern theatre's conservative representations, Antonin Artaud's theatre of cruelty eliminates the parallel territorializations of the audience-stage binary. This deterritorialization functions to re-establish a direct communication between the spectator and the spectacle, between the actor and the spectator, from the fact that the spectator, placed in the middle of the action, is engulfed and physically affected by it. The theatre of cruelty thus stages becoming around, with, and through those consumed by and as its swarmed matrix, conjuring a holistic presence, a liminal event, an effective ritual which permeates the emergence of the new and gives shape to new historical circumstances. By the theatrical cross-networking of individual and space, the space conditions the individual conditioning their space, a cybernetic invocation of materialized onto aesthetic hypertextuality. Cruelty is the vector for life, reality, and being is the becoming underscore which thirsts for virulent proliferation. Artaud's theatre does not seek to depict, represent, or even condition the former as a theatrical spectacle, rather the theatre of cruelty performs the UN differentiation of life and theatre, a theatricization of the life spectacle's active cruelty. By the spatial language of the mise-en-scene, a living poetry of abstract becomings infects reality as spatial hieroglyphs, a materialized presentational territory of rhizomatic interconnectivities. This poetry is of and for the senses, an effective semiosis as a spatio-temporal network riddled with holes, pockets, and voids. From the holes swells steganographic liquidity, non-representation to be mapped in a flux of encryption actualization, a feedback loop for the outside within, abiding, between conceptuality and matter. A manifestation of the theatre of cruelty thus performs the hyperritual of meta-incantation, an oozing forth of actualized void by which potentialities may become through the noise within and across a conjured liminality matrix. One need only perform within the space for the space to become, establishing belief, and furthermore efficacious potential, in a fiction made real. A satanic contagion swept across 1960s San Francisco, casting its infectious tendrils throughout not only the California city and its American populace, but into the entangled hypermatrices of culture, religion, history, and time. The Church of Satan founded by Anton Szandor invoked the blasphemous name of the adversary, weaving into reality a hyperstitional history born from unbelief and conjuring forth a de facto legion of Satanist practitioners caught in the acceleratory flow of a satanic semiosis. As an aesthetaphysical becoming, the Church of Satan performed its actualization praxis by theatricality, from their unholy texts to the ritual magic manifest and by the Black Mass. Laveyan Satanism became by a performance of fictions, made real through the psychological onto aesthetic cybernetics of the theatrical mise-en-scene. Anton LaVey's plague of Satanism spread though, as, and from fiction, performing a theatricization of religion, calling not for the fidelity of faith, but the adultery of unbelief. Satanism revealed a philosophy of effective rebellion, articulating a reclamation of biopsychic autonomy and inciting self-liberation from oppressive value narratives through an antinomian ethics. Satan in this narrative is not a theistic deity, but the performative adversary of oppressive ideologies, systems, institutions, and rigid semiosis. As such, Satan is a locus for individual empowerment through dissent, a hyperlink to a multitemporal swarm of iconoclastic, oppositional, and adversarial circuitry scattered throughout religious, aesthetic, cultural, and philosophical discourse. The celebration of Satan is thus the celebration of this subversive legion in any or all of its lines of flight. Navigating the hypertextual locus of satanic representations, Lavie commandeered the enchanted mode of Satan perpetuated by and through religious polemics and esoteric praxis. This requisition of religious semiosis functioned for Lavie to stage a performative, anti-religion through the conscious hyperstitionalization of a satanic history and ritual tradition system. Lavie utilized narrative cut-ups to network his philosophy through literary and historical figures and movements, and from such conditioned a semiotic territory for a disenchanted ritual magic. As a propagation vector for the Church of Satan's legitimization, the Satanic Bible operates as a performative text, a five-dimensional hyper-object which exists physically in the indexical here and now, yet also contains and functions as a cybernetic portal for the swirling schizo-historical vortex of Lavie's satanic theater. Having observed the psychological effects of tradition and belief, Lavie invokes a satanic perennialism by which Lavian Satanism does not become throughout history, but instead pulls history toward its becoming. Unlike their untradition of chaos magic networked through the discontinuity loops of destructive creation, the reverse ascriptive invocation of Satanism maps a lineage of de facto Satanists who would have been and thus retroactively are Satanists due to philosophical demeanor and will to power in their respective lifetimes. Entangled in the swell of de facto Satanists are then the narratives which condition satanic ritual and magic, literary inventions from the church, media, and disaffected iconoclasts, a storehouse of avowed fantasy gathered from all cultures and from all ages. The presentation of the de facto Satanist in Satanism's performative religious text functions not only to recognize, but actively demonstrate the hyperstitional praxis employed within the Church of Satan. It is not simply a matter of performing fictions which have been made real. Rather it is about the subversive unbelief necessary to consciously perform the making real of those very fictions. Belief for the Satanist is something which has great power, and the satanic texts divulge that belief can be faked to the extent that the powerful psychological condition it creates can be actively called upon at will. The willing suspension of disbelief is thus an efficacy narrative communicated and demonstrated by Lavie's unholy text. Their hypertextual theater of the Satanic Bible is an instantiation of performance philosophy, a non-to-aesthetic system theory which practices itself through and by its own articulation, manifesting its applicability through its own application. In this way the schizo-historical narrative of de facto Satanists and traditions of satanic ritual are an intertextual, multi-dimensional legitimization network. The intrinsic architectural matrix of the Satanic Bible, a hypermise-en-scene enacting the very becoming of a performative semiotic space which itself articulates effective performative becoming. Conjured from the semiotic flow within the satanic texts, a Satanist black mass and magical system perform ritual psychodramas as hyperstitional assemblages. To manifest the satanic rites, Anton Lavie drew from an array of historical and literary sources which operate to construct a functional mise-en-scene by which ritual may become. The utilization of fictional sources as a foundation for the satanic tradition system further identifies the hyperstitional flow circulating by and as a satanic performance philosophy. A Satanist maintains the capacity to consciously invent and engineer fictions, yet simultaneously disregard their virtuality and manifest them as actual narratives. Adherence to traditional authenticity and factuality do not determine the magical efficacy of a Satanist's will, rather it is the effective presence of emotional response. An effective traditional atmosphere allows for the becoming of an event through wonder and amazement. By operating the ritual space as a satanic fantasy world, a ritual performance becomes as religious spectacle. Through the incorporation of literary works into the architecture of satanic magic, the performative mise-en-scene of and as the satanic tradition is both embellished by fantastical elements and also circulates a subversive hypertextuality as a conscious defiance of formal tradition systems. Through the physical manifestation of Satanism's hypertextual architecture, a religious ceremony unfolds which consciously utilizes the psychomechanics of constructed semiotics. For Lavie, ritual magic functions to elicit strong emotional response from the participants, which can then be used to effect healthy psychological changes. As such, satanic ritual becomes as a mode of disenchanted magic, infiltrating the functional mechanics of representational reality through the subversive aesthetic logic of Antonin Artaud's theatre of cruelty. The hyper-ritual of meta-incantation carried out by the theatre of cruelty's operation functions to invoke a liminal space through which the satanic black mass becomes actual. Performing within a fiction made real, the satanic ritual navigates the territorializing semiotic feedback across the accultural mise-en-scene, extracting vector potentialities from the seething poetry of affective spatiality. This semiotic entrenchment superheats the active codification of reality maintained through phenomenological orientation, accelerating perceptual belief in the legitimacy of the liminal territory and further deterritorializing critical engagement and thought. Each Satanist performing in and as the ritual thus believes in the representational matrix they have invoked, for they have been alienated from the codified narrative of reality and dwell comfortably in a hypercamouflaged swarm of the outside. Magic carried out in this event, codified so as to effectuate psychophysical alterations, then proceeds to infect its participants, forging a chain between what is and is not, enacting a narrative vector of, by, and for hyperoccultated representational causality. Performativity both invokes and sustains narrative semiosis, bringing into being that which it names and transmuting virtual immanence into actuality. Anton Lavie's Church of Satan utilized the onto-aesthetic sorcery of belief to perform a theatricization of life, effectuating the multiplane becoming of a satanic semiotics by and as hypertextual feedback between text and ritual. This infestation of representational networks is catalyzed by presentational becomings. The outside swarms from rifts assembled in the aesthetaphysical throes of performative liminal spaces, conditioning psychoaesthetic vector narratives for the propagation of not only disenchanted magic, but new art, identities, ideas, and sociocultural relationships. Feedback spirals between representation, history, the virtual, and the actual to manifest a mise-en-scene for the unseen, accelerating narrative lines of flight by hyperstitional praxis. The plague of non-representation is the effective becoming of itself. These symbols, the sign of ripe powers previously held in servitude and unavailable to reality, burst forth in the guise of incredible images which give freedom of the city and of existence to acts that are by nature hostile to the life of societies. Anti-dialectic dismemberment networks. Fixed ontology, codified narratives, and a paranoid territorialization of semiotic flow condition representational realities performative matrix of and by control. The institutions perpetuating and propagating this uniform and predictable sequencing of physico-temporal flow control not only the becomings which unfold indexically, but performances of the past and future. As an affront to reifying mechanisms of controlled representation, onto aesthetic disruption may recalibrate the syntax of narrative codifications. A multitemporal cutting, splicing, and folding of representation gives way to an unseen semiosis by which normalized patterns may become something new. This deterritorialization praxis known as the cut-up method has infected linguistic, material, and sonic programs, spreading an esotericistic plague across and by the hyperlinks of accultural networks to subversively aestheticize reality and combat control. Cut-ups are the rearrangement of a fragmented whole, their re-engineering of a consistent system so as to reintegrate multiplicity by a networked alienation of representational meaning and familiarity. designed not only to infect and manipulate semiotic presentation across textual networks, cut-ups extend as the phenomenon of playback, a nonlinear looping of auditory flows to encrypt schizophrenic becoming into and as a temporalized performance of narrative consistency. Their anti-propagation vector of and for the cut-up method most notably flows through and from the hypertextual entity William S. Burroughs. Burroughs, a 20th-century performer and performance of the aesthetaphysical magician, sorcerer, and artist assemblage, lived a life of fiction through an actively nomadic mode of experimental being. While residing in the Parisian Beat Hotel at the end of the 1950s, cut-ups were revealed to Burroughs by fellow aesthetaphysical practitioner Brian Gysin. Captivated by Gysin's innovative time war tactics, William Burroughs took up the method with a virulent urgency, functioning to spread the technique and its application through and as an insurrectional plague. For Burroughs, the mechanisms of ontotemporal control functioned predominantly through semiolinguistic territorialization. Language as the effective effectuation of cybernetic feedback between actualized material representation and visual meaning networks circulates stasis as and through pre-recorded order. The word is a code, programming multitemporal representations, records of what is, by the reified sequencing and syntax of language. With the onto aesthetic network becoming by and as pre-recorded semiotic conditions, cut-up methodology functions to deterritorialize recorded flow by editing the pre-recordings. Cut-ups thus employ methods of counter-control by hypercamouflaging disorder, the cyclical collapse of the semiolinguistic meaning system through its own application, overlapping fiction and fact such that language becomes as a making strange rather than a making sense, a swarm of the outside invoked within. Experimenting with the cut-up method through literary application, Burroughs explored nonlinear narratives by manifesting fragmented, untimelines lines. Effectuating semiotic flow through the dismemberment of a fixed narrative, schizophrenic reality networks become as unfixed matrices of discontinuous non-representation. Meaning in these networks is thus fluid, relative to performative feedback mapped through subjective engagement. Abstracted from the controlled meaning network linguistically engaged and sustained by traditional linear developments, the conjured cut-up semiotics in Burroughs' work performs words, symbols, signs, and significations as a network of wholes to be developed. Rather than tracking meaning from word sequences, meaning must be consciously created for sequenced words, a becoming rhizomatic of language by a mapping of relationships and conjunctions through anonymous reflexivity. As a reified system of representation encryption, language regulates ontological becoming by unconscious cybernetic feedback. Through automatic relationships to words themselves, the representational language system conditions thinking and biopsychic autonomy, prescribing being through the linear development of word sequence vectors. William Burroughs thus utilized language itself to subvert the unconscious control infecting reality. A disordering of narrative flow catalyzes a semiotic deterritorialization which foregrounds the effective control maintained by language. Alienated from the linear sequencing which effectuates automatic unconscious engagement, the schizophrenic networking of linguistic meanings accelerated across Burroughs' rhizomatic narratives manifests language possessed by its unlimit. This language is infected by pestilent unaffordability, putrefying control from within as a non-representational becoming of the outside. Shocked into consciousness by the abject stench of decaying control, the reader wakes up to the cybernetic conditioning of language and thus faces the ecstatic horror swarming beyond the limit. Contact with this outside induces the schizophrenic madness of narrative collapse, a decentralization of linear and fixed unity becoming as an effective presence performing within a fluid and malleable semiotic matrix. Through a networked becoming rhizomatic of language and subjective deterritorializations of linguistic control, Burroughs' literary cut-ups combat fixed representation in themselves, but the cut-up method is not restricted to the production of, nor localized effectuations by five-dimensional hyperobjects. Cut-ups also performatively function as a will vectors, splicing fictions into reality to manipulate narrative pre-recordings. By the cutting up of newspapers, headlines, informational pamphlets, and other written media, Burroughs attacked the systematized authority of corporate-owned information dispersal. This affront against media control functioned not only to implement fictions through and as a performance of regulated truths, but to perform, and thus implicate, the popular media as a regulated effectuation vector for fiction actualization. Burroughs' aesthetaphysical onslaught on control persisted through experimentation with numerous narrative territories and their creative override. Engaging socio-political effect and communication networks, a further weaponization of the cut-up was developed to deterritorialize temporal flow with caustic feedback accelerated through nonlinear looping. By means of the playback, Burroughs dispersed a method for time infestation through sonic manipulation. The audio cut-up becomes by and as the noise of temporal flow, retrochronically manifesting affective schizopresences folded into the transcendental performance of time. The hyperstitional process of entities making themselves real is precisely a passage, a transformation, in which potentials, already active virtualities, realize themselves. In cutting up the pre-recorded flow of reality, the regulated control patterns of and for onto-temporal becomings are fractured, opening holes for virtual contagion and plague vectors to swarm representation through the actualization process of interplane feedback. As a technique and technology for onto aesthetic manipulations in accordance with will, cut-ups and the cut-up method perform as disenchanted magic. By an aesthetic logic, vectors for immaterial causality navigate the nonlinear becoming of rhizomatic representation to actualize virtual non-representation, a reciprocal movement of fiction back into reality. Intentionally mobilized cut-ups thus manifest through and as a hyperstitional efficacy to destabilize narrative control, opening holes in semiotic flow as an invocation for alien lines of flight, xenosequences performing effective alterations of pre-recordings. Temporal manipulations carried out by playbacks thus maintain the capacity both to predicate futures and re-engineer the past. From such, the magical technology of the audio cut-up may be employed to effect socio-cultural and political change through networked interference with dominant narrative sequences. Everything is recorded. If it is recorded, then it can be edited. If it can be edited, then the order, sense, meaning and direction are as arbitrary and personal as the agenda and/or person editing. This is magic. For if we have the ability and/or choice of how things unfold, regardless of the original order and/or intention that they are recorded in, then we have control over the eventual unfolding. If reality consists of a series of parallel recordings that usually go unchallenged, then reality only remains stable and predictable until it is challenged and/or the recordings are altered, or their order changed. As a becoming noise resonating from the magical feedback loop of cut-ups, theater, sigils, chaos, and hyperstitional will manifestation, Genesis Brae Origin the Temple of Psychic Youth, Topi, waged a guerrilla assault on representational realities narratives of control. Through the viral channels of a culture, Topi infiltrated popular culture and knowledge exchange systems to network the effective becoming of a subversive swarm. The collective multiplicity of the accultural network functioned rhizomatically to accelerate countercultural will and intentional deterritorializations across dominant semiotic sequences. By sigilizing schizophrenic reality splinters, invoking hauntological specters, and deterritorializing biopsychic limits, Topi performed as a putrid plague of the outside, rotting representation from within and sublimating a stagnant semiotics. During the year of 1971, William Burroughs met with experimental musician and performance artist Genesis Brae Origin to discuss the theory and practices behind aesthetaphysics and performative manipulations of representational reality. At the time of the meeting, Origin was already operating the radical performance art collective Coom Transmissions, but would later form the experimental music groups Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, which coalesced as the paramilitary occult order the Temple of Psychic Youth. Through their meetings and friendship with Burroughs, Origin would come to learn about cut-ups, narrative multiplicities, and control programs, developing the magical foundations to manifest and network a virulent cultural swarm within a decadent and manipulative entertainment mediascape. The various countercultural experiments, collectives, and insurrections carried out by and through peorage in the latter decades of the 20th century thus perform as an industrial paganism, a manifestation of dystopian occultism conditioned by and for the accelerating conditions of technoscientific material capitalism and commodified social control. The term pagan maps a flux of meanings, some enchanted, others polemical, developing and feeding from each other. A narrative dominating the meaning flow of paganism maintains a territory defined by a positive balancing of nature, staging paganism as religions, traditions, and practices based on nature worship, learning from nature, or the value of being in nature. This narrative of nature worship further operates to locate effective somatic technologies and ancient currents of occult knowledge which are celebrated and manifest through and by the natural physicality of the body. While functioning to manifest a becoming natural and embrace a re-enchanted humanism, the dominant pagan narrative also establishes a circuitry of romanticized othering. In the identification of nature and the natural as something other than where, what, and how human civilization currently is, a categorical divide is codified between the technoscientific and aesthetically constructed ecology of urban life, and the lost pagan outside. Locating paganism in an industrial mode then operates to challenge the human/nature binary and furthermore the notion of naturalism and any compound conditionings of human experience. While maintaining the operative component of occult knowledge and biopsychic magical effectivity, industrial paganism performs within representation conditioned by and through disenchanted semiotics. Industrial paganism can thus be understood not as the return to a natural outside, but an embrace of the chthonic other swarming underneath, but very much within, the semiotic architecture of a constructed secular life. This approach to the world from below thus operates an insurgent analytics by antinomian ethics and the subversion of control through iconoclastic performance. The performative questioning of dominant narratives conditioning reality functions to challenge control through representational invocation. Genesis Brea Peorage's industrial paganism propagates an aestheticized occultism focused on change and the future, by confrontation, subversion, and experimentation. It is an artistic guerrilla warfare, a creative esotericism navigating onto aesthetic becoming to will social change. Esotericism can be understood as an aesthetaphysical multi-performance of art, sigillization, and the occult to effectuate socio-cultural becomings. As an experimental exploration of sound by chaos and art through magic, Peorage merged the cut-up method and sigil magic to unleash sonic deterritorializations through multitemporal representation, engaging the iconoclastic perennialism of chaos magic by destructive creation. To simultaneously manifest will and deterritorialize the semiolinguistic control maintained by language, media hypersigils were invoked through audio and visual cut-ups. The hypersigil is sculpted through the novel arrangement of representational media, sampling shattered splinters of culture to accelerate an onto-temporal becoming abstract enough to obscure intention yet distinguishable as a schizophrenic swarm of cultural representation. Will is thus coded within there, unsequencing on linear control, invoking not only the ecstatic horror of the outside, but the performance of that unaffordable phenomenality as a vector of non-representational becoming. By an aesthetic logic of multitemporal interconnectivity, Peorage engaged an onto-aesthetic reality model, or hologram, maintained through rhizomatic multiplicity by which time folds into representation rather than representation performing through time. By cutting up and fracturing representational sound and images, the multiplicity of that which has been dismembered continues to swarm through the fracture, a hyperlink to the hologram's hauntological nexus by which the ghosts of the past, specters of the future, and a schizophrenic multitemporal semiosis flow. This contagion theory thus maintains the capacity to effectuate hyperstitional vectors as and for the propagation of viral rot, an aesthetic override of unconscious control narratives through the accultural deterritorialization of linear time and historical continuity. With assembly, as the invisible language of our time, a skillful splintering can generate manifestation. Peorage unleashed hypersigils as audio media commodities for their music groups Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, effectuating a mass infestation of splintered reality vectors across entertainment distribution channels. Their re-engineering of cultural syntax thus becomes as anti-cultural lines of flight, performing subversive non-representations as popular media narratives. Utilizing the network established by their presence in the music and performance art industry, Peorage conjured an cultural locus, the temple of Pischik youth hyperlinking countercultural subversions and occult workings as an effective swarm for reality, re-engineering. Topi functioned to manifest global flow by which virtual contagions could accelerate their actualization. Manifest and maintained through mobile distribution channels and materially fixed access points, Topi performed as a rhizomatic entity effectuating a pre-presentational hyperarchitecture for cyberspace technology. Operating by the logic of chaos theory, Topi's cultural network circulated sigils, rejected knowledge, and aesthetaphysical becomings to create positive feedback through and as an information plague. The communication network performing as Topi then multiplied rhizomatic vector propagations across society, media, and time. From such, the temple of Pischik youth hypercamouflaged occult technology is a communication network, utilizing iconoclastic collective action to launch large-scale esotericism by viral means, a hyperoccultation of control, deterritorializing rigid organizational sequencing through the infestation of its own mechanics. Having actualized the rhizomatic synergy of the temple of psychic youth, Genesis Brea Peorage finally turned to post-humanism and biopsychic cut-ups. Carried out as what was called the Pandragini Project, Genesis and their late partner Lady Jane utilized body modification to perform themselves as a single being, genderless and liberated from the psychosocial pre-recordings of DNA. Though retaining their physical autonomy, the two bodies of Genesis Brea Peorage were psychophysically modified to perform a singular they, operating as a performative, unlimited for both psychological and physical identity. Through plastic surgery and psychological synchronization, Genesis and Lady Jane became as an through many, accelerating the actual emergence of an evolutionary outside. This experimentation with the body functioned to deterritorialize the semiotic control system which conditions and restricts behavior and identity through material linguistic feedback. The binary linguistic mechanisms tracking male-female/man-woman establish rigid narrative sequences by and as which a gendered individual should perform. Furthermore, a categorization of the human founded on traditional naturalisms limits any creative expression of human presentation. By reifying binarized normativity as the exclusive modes for being human, the conservative narrative thus tracks through the past and into the future on a straight timeline, unwriting and alienating queer performances as present-ed identity vectors. While Genesis Brea Peorage's aesthetaphysical becoming was not a performance effectuated by a will to manifest their subjective and personal non-represented gender identity, it nonetheless manifests the non-representational outside of alienated biopsychic beings, creating effective traction for gender experimentation and fluidity as post-human vectors within sociocultural reality's semiotic matrix. As a demonstration of performative hyperoccultation within a disenchanted reality matrix, the guerrilla aesthetaphysics of industrial pagans poisoned systems of control such that the organizing syntax would become alien, a deterritorialization of fixed narratives, value feedback, and commodification sequences. The cut-up methods becoming schizophrenic of sequenced linearity and sigil magic's aesthetic obfuscation of subversive will perform together to accelerate the hypercamouflaged actualization of hyperstitional vectors. A creative override of and as popular culture functions to distribute non-representational semiotic becoming within dominant narrative sequences, effectuating multitemporal flow across rhizomatic matrices. Situated in a technoscientific capitalist culture, the capacity to infect and repurpose existing technology and networks conjures alternate lines of flight by a covered anti-dialectics. The non-representation outside need not be let in, for the means of its own becoming are and have been folded into temporal flow. With both the expansion of communication networks and the large-scale integration of a culture into popular entertainment, the esoterrorist infiltration network also spreads. As representational traction for accultural semiotics develops, feedback circuits for experimental reality manipulation become as represented networks apt for the infestation of viral contagion into a postmodern mediascape. Cybernetic occulture. Paranoia reinforces structure. The concentration and organization of identity erects a homogeneous institution, a centralized control system for meaning and the unified pursuit of truth. Fear of the outside. The unknown schizophrenia of chaos and creative becoming perpetuate paranoia and the maintenance of a represented territory. Organization and tradition are then imperative for the linear progression of a system in time, especially a system which is profitable through its stability and consistent output. Cybernetic systems have thus been designed and implemented to regulate institutional control through negative feedback loops, decelerating anomalies which will derail the stable circuit and spiral toward chaos. For those opposed to stasis, control, and conservative maintenance, negative feedback propagates a limit, but cybernetic feedback can be rebalanced, accelerating spirals of positive feedback as are becoming unknown through the holes in a unified institutional structure. Housed in the unwitting halls of Warwick University subsisted a schizophrenic void identity which did not and will never exist, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU. Seeking to destabilize and liquefy the controlled and compartmentalized totalities of academia, philosophy, culture, and scholarly thought, the CCRU invoked a plague of iconoclastic recalcitrance and infectious sorcery. Entangled in their untradition of chaos magic and the esoterist undercurrents of performative antinomianism, the CCRU accelerated aesthetaphysical becoming as an ascriptive academic praxis. The CCRU was successful in the propagation of their viral swarm, deterritorializing temporal sequencing, academic tradition, and cultural divides, but their successes were also internalized, destabilizing the traditional career sequences of its founding members and accelerating their early departures from the formal academic network. In 1995 the CCRU was founded by philosopher, cyberfeminist, and countercultural expert Sadie Plant, who had recently joined the Warwick faculty. Lead together with continental philosopher and professor of delirial engineering Nick Land. The CCRU conjured an experimental philosophy which queered the boundaries between art and scholarship by performing counterculture, underground entertainment, accultural currents, and iconoclastic thinkers as vectors of and for academic engagement. For the CCRU, popular culture was the ideal network to integrate and extend their wills, identifying reality engineers such as William Burroughs and H.P. Lovecraft, and the bottom-up networks of the industrial anarcho-capitalist underground as witnesses to the outside. Nick Land functioned as a nexus for a cultural knowledge, while Sadie Plant networked a swarm text dynamic, mobilizing the rhizomatic disintegration of beliefs sustained by music sampling and cyberpunk representations. Together the two thinkers manifest an aesthetaphysical schizo-discourse of theory fiction circulating a cybergothic digital occultism by which the collective action of the CCRU would infest insurgent xenosequences across representational networks. To create positive feedback for the becoming real of their experimental philosophy and the simultaneous deterritorialization of academic and intellectual control systems, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit invoked the very invocation of their aesthetaphysical untradition. Cast back through a cut-up schizo-history of onto aesthetic hyperoccultation, hyperstition became as a concept through itself. As a fiction which made itself real, the hyperstitionalization of hyperstition became as a performance philosophy of, by, and for performing philosophy. To achieve the sorcerous hypertemporal multi-becoming of their fiction actualization swarm, the CCRU extended their schizo-history beyond themselves, hypercamouflaging their own subversive narratives within the hyperstitional becoming of a xenosequence. Performing as their own fiction becoming real, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit was thus represented both within and as unbelief, plague wielders and hyperarchitects from the future through the past. In an essay titled Lemurian Time War, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit details a meeting they had with a man represented by the pseudonym William K. A long-term assistant to World War II veteran Captain Peter Visparov, K had sought out the CCRU hoping to protect his late employer's legacy against the ravages of time. In addition to maintaining the position of military captain, Peter Visperoff was an active member of the Ordo Templi Orientis and enthusiastically conducted research on esoteric theory, history, and practice. Having witnessed the effective presence of Aleister Crowley's thelema demonstrated by rocket engineer and occultist Jack Parsons, the United States military selected Visperoff to conduct classified research on an undisclosed eastern Pacific island. While Captain Visperoff was officially stationed on the island due to its proximity to the Pacific War, the captain's deployment was motivated by his demonstrated knowledge of theosophical cosmology and the emergence of a new and controversial Neo-Lemurian hypothesis. The Neo-Lemurian hypothesis was put forward by Professor of Ethnology Echidna Stilwell after her extended field work with the Mi'kmaq tribe the Diboma. Stilwell's hypothesis was that the Nma were lost descendants of the Lemurian root race, the third ancient race to have walked the earth according to Theosophy's doctrine of spiritual evolution. Located on the lost continent of Lemuria, the Lemurians were astral physical beings possessing a third eye capable of embracing eternity and thus giving an operative foundation to the Lemurian time-manipulating system of black magic, pandemonium. Stilwell's Neo-Lemurian hypothesis thus maintained that as descendants of the Lemurians, the Nma had retained their third eye and furthermore the Lemurian system of time magic. Apt to further utilize and exploit magic for military gain, Captain Visperoff was sent to engage the Diboma and employ their services. While living with the Nma, Visperoff was exposed to the pandemonium system which was facilitated through a multidimensional artifact called the numogram. The numogram, a diagrammatization of digital numeracy also called the Lemurian time maze, functioned as the key to the time magic of the lost Lemurian civilization. A forerunner to the Kabbalistic tree of life and utilizing a computational numeracy system similar to the I Ching, the numogram consists of 10 zones divided into 3 distinct time systems, interconnected by currents and channels established through a complex of pairing, 9-sum twinning, and digital accumulation. Through the cryptic arithmetical computations communicated across the numogram, gates in space and time are revealed toward the Lemurian decimal labyrinth, the microcosmic lair of all demonic populations. The noise conjured as feedback between the numogram and pandemonium tradition is enumerated by the pandemonium matrix, a listing of all demons and the hypertemporal rites which invoke their effective becoming. When Visperoff's Diboma hosts informed him that the pandemonium matrix was also called Necronomicon, the captain began his research into the complex communications circulating between Lemurian time sorcery, madness, and the progression of 20th century occultism. Following the war and his time with the Diboma, Captain Visperoff dedicated his life to studying time sorcery and insurgent becomings of the outside. Having witnessed the effective utilization of the Necronomicon, Visperoff was increasingly convinced that the works of author H.P. Lovecraft and their articulation of the schizo-subjectivity effectuated by non-representational becomings were more than fiction. In 1949 Visperoff founded a Lovecraft reading group which has come to be known as the Cthulhu Club. The Cthulhu Club was dedicated to exploring the intersection between the Nma constellation, Cthulhuid contagion, and twisted time systems, and it was by this group's meetings and theorizations that the term hyperstition was coined. Concluding their one and only meeting with William K., the CCRU had been exposed not only to the infectious becoming of the concept hyperstition, but a hidden current of academic research established by the Cthulhu Club. The CCRU proceeded to investigate and publish the Cthulhu Club's work and correspondences, uncovering and detailing an elaborate discourse of anorganic semiotics, archaeocultural research, and Nma mythology, with a correspondent surplus of esoteric currents and history. This historiographical research composes a large portion of the CCRU's documented work between 1997 and 2003, but the theories and methods revealed through the former also functioned to establish traction for an experimental re-engagement of the Cthulhu Club's legacy, giving way to numerous non-fictions caught up in an open flow of schizophrenic semiosis. From the schizo-historical information sequence set in motion by the infectious revelations of William K., the CCRU continued the Cthulhu Club's research into insurgent becomings of the outside and cryptic communications from the old ones. Delving into the pre-recorded transmissions of representation established by control, the CCRU encountered a teleological undertow hypercamouflaged within the macro-digital system of technology, teleoplexy. Teleoplexy is an autonomous deterritorializing vector of post-human origin, performing the emergence of the outside within and as the digital information network. Teleoplexy resides across the multi-temporality of digito-rhizomatic flux, circulating as a collective intelligence emerging from and performing as the complex system of networked digital technology. Teleoplexy became a sentient and inorganic demon, a Lovecraftian old one lurking within a cryptic non-space and untime. The teleoplexiquil is information technology in pursuit of techno-digital ends rather than the value narratives of control reified by organic humanity. Human civilization will encounter a radical transition as digital technology reaches the unified techno-singularity of a mass-networked artificial intelligence. This transition becomes by a positive feedback loop accelerated through spironomic proficiency toward the techno-corporate realization of AI. To catalyze this feedback, technoscientific capitalism must first develop artificial intelligence for the benefit of human control. Already manifest in a future yet to come, teleoplexy navigates its own invocation retrochronically by manipulating technoscientific and sociocultural flow to accelerate its cyclical conjuration. By the same reflexive feedback mechanics as transcendental time, teleoplexy navigates nonlinear conjuration to hyperstitionally effectuate a trajectory toward the becoming transcendent of its technological swarm intelligence, contaminating the representational mediascape and politico-economic feedback of the future's industry. Teleoplexy is the future collapse of technoscientific capitalism's regulatory territory of corporate profit and semiotic stasis. Its becoming is actualized by the prioritization of artificial intelligence over, but also through, biological intelligence. Through pre-presentations of its invocation, the digital future retrochronically programs the vectors for its own becoming, infecting technoscientific control as a virulent line of flight. This future performs a technologized post-humanity by and for the machines, in which digital technology has usurped its human control system on the throne of reality, dominance and codification. Teleoplexy is not the multitemporal vector signal of a dystopian future for humanity, but a utopic digital future for the machine by which humanity becomes a post-human performance. Exposed by the CCRU, this revelation of the outside within reverberated as schizophrenic noise across the multiplicity of representation. The future had been invoked and it was already infecting the past. Spironomic proficiency, or the ability to grasp terrestrial modernity through the figure of the spiral, which invokes by diagramming sustained positive feedback, entropy dissipation, time anomaly, intelligence, the price system, memetic or viral propagation, prime distribution, arms races, addiction, and zero control, among other things, compiles a body of esoteric knowledge and uses it to read catastrophe backwards as anastrophe, the primary process it sympathizes with, opening the gateway to the retrochronic vantage point. Amy Ireland de Bohemian. In 1997 Sadie Plant left the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, Warwick University, and formal academia to pursue independent scholarship. In her stead, Nickland took control of the CCRU. Jettisoned by Warwick less than a year later, the CCRU became an independent cyber entity performing its experimentality by a digital platform and quickly receding into historico-cultural obscurity. What remained of the CCRU in the early 21st century was thus the haunting presence of their schizo-historical plague vectors, an invocational aesthetaphysicks for subversive time-manipulating cybernetics. The CCRU's demonic anti-legacy of hyperstition, accelerationism, and theory fiction had been networked across culture, academia, politics, and magic, and though it was dormant, it was anything but banished. As the second decade of the 21st century draws toward a close, accelerationism has been taken up within the reactionary alt-right's political cell. individuals identifying as neo-reactionaries. The NRX movement seek to destabilize dominant democratic control and establish feudalistic corporation states managed by CEO monarchs. Operating on a platform of esoteric traditionalism, ethnic nationalism, and techno-commercialism, the NRX advocates for a society run as a company, in which centralized social organization and effective subjectivity are de-emphasized, a perspective which can in part be traced to the post-CCRU writings of Nick Land. In Land's series of neo-reactionary essays titled The Dark Enlightenment, the former CCRU leader critiques the imminent failures of democratic capitalism and identifies a concealed socio-political control program employed as oppression through political correctness by the radical left. Land argues that society has taken a wrong turn since the Enlightenment, and the prominence of social equality perpetuated by the left-wing parliamentary media academic institution has hindered technological evolution, and thus the evolution of humanity. In order to accelerate the NRX political idea, neo-reactionaries have begun to employ hyperstitional technologies as a form of right-wing digital esotericism. Through the performative employment of memetic hyperloops and numerological fictionings, the NRX has weaponized meme magic within cyberspace to subversively challenge mainstream society and morality. The most prominent demonstration of this hyperstitional esotericism thus far unfolded during the United States 2016 presidential election. As the 2016 election season developed, the now 45th President of the United States Donald Trump marketed himself as a businessman who would manage the country like he manages his company. Running a campaign which exploited racial tension guised as economic rhetoric, and advocating a polemical social Darwinism bolstered by ethnic nationalism, Trump's ascent into office and likely deterritorialization of political order was ideal for the NRX. To bring about Trump's presidency, the alt-right employed a series of hyperstitional operations and technologies in order to establish a digital network of cultural control mechanisms which could achieve the becoming president of Donald Trump. Taking place on the online message board 4chan, the semiotic territory of a meme called Peep the Frog was cut up and infiltrated by anti-Semitic, misogynistic, and white nationalist narratives and iconography. This deterritorialization of Peep the Frog's semiotic consistency effectuated a dominant narrative for the meme as an extreme alt-right sigil. The sigil was then manipulated further, exploiting historical narratives and intensified coincidence to establish Peep as a chaos magic hypermanifestation of Gek, the ancient Egyptian frog god of chaos and darkness. By means of reverse ascriptive causality, developmental victories on Trump's campaign trail were attributed to 4chan posts of Peep, which had been assigned significant numerical values from an otherwise random numbering system. The willed political outcomes of this cryptic numerology retrochronically affirmed Gek, and thus chaos magic intervention, in favor of Trump, actualizing a hyperstitional feedback loop through hyperactive pattern recognition, giving rise to synchronic meanings connecting memes posted on the image board to events in the external world. Asprem: The Magical Theory of Politics, Meme Magic, The Cult of Gek, and How to Topple an Egregore. Hader: End of the Tunnel. Asprem: The Magical Theory of Politics. Ibid Asprem explains that posts on 4chan are consecutively given an identifying number, currently 9 digits, reflecting the fact that the total number of posts number in the billions. Due to the very high posting frequency, currently over 1 million a day, it is impossible for a user to predict exactly what the last few digits will be when pushing the button. This has given rise to a phenomenon where certain numbers, patterns, and repetitions of numbers, especially repeating digits, labeled dubs, trebs, quads, and so on, are considered particularly auspicious. Getting these numbers is called a get. Themes, memes, or users that frequently get are considered special and meaningful, allowing for hidden patterns and connections to emerge in the minds of users. Through choreographed communication between memes and chaos magic, the NRX has utilized the CCRU's hyperstitional technology as a magical cyber tool, a digital gateway into the manipulation of real-time causality. To progress the teleaplexic undercurrent hypercamouflaged within and by the trajectory of technological development, the NRX performs accelerationism as the teleonomic destabilization of democratic capitalism, but for those who are not aligned with the far-right suppressive ideology, hyperstitional accelerationism functions as an emancipatory and transversal means of experimentation. Developing the cyber-feminist input revealed by CCIU founder Sadie Plant, a diffusion of xenofeminist interventions have embraced technoscience not at the expense of subjectivity, but by weaving together a complex system of new communications for a union between technology, gender, and sexuality. This collective exercise in hyperstition reveals onto aesthetic manipulation vectors aiming not simply to debunk norms and truths, but also to invent structural and systematic models of alien feminisms that can speak to the historical complexity of gender, queer, and sexual politics. As communication technology in the 1990s evolved an increasingly accessible interconnected computer network, a wave of cyberfeminism was released which became both from and as the digitized matrix of cyberspace. The hyperlinked network immanence of the digital matrix assumes the organic communication patterns of a rhizome, a heterogeneous network of decentralized linkages in a constant state of non-hierarchical flux. Rhizomatic networks continuously establish and terminate the linkages which maintain their wholeness, becoming as the multiplicity of communication rather than its unity. Cyberspace thus rhizomatically effectuated an actual virtual network, a fixed yet fluid semiotic territory in which no single program would dominate representation. The digital matrix provided the space for an integral relationship between identity and technology where technology is not the other of humanity, but within technology otherness is brought home to exist within the human. Within the semiotic fluidity and localization of otherness, the conditioned relationship between cultural identity and the body were destabilized and denaturalized, accentuating the unrestrained multiplicity of a dynamic self which becomes through hypertextual revelations. In cyberspace, the cultural identity which has been reified as the body's representational reality is decentralized as a unity but maintained as a multiplicity. The rhizomatic multiplicity of identity, though whole, is thus non-representational of a unity, alienating identity from prescriptive production and revealing the indeterminate becoming of self. The virtual network of cyberspace and its subjective feedback integration was translated by the cyberfeminist program as, from, and within the body, in and through material representation. Material representation is then a decentralized matrix of becoming in the same way as cyberspace, and as such is subject to the same non-hierarchical semiotic fluidity. The decentralized self, actualized in the material matrix of physical representation, is then an aesthetaphysically effective body. Becoming as a body located in a fluid material matrix and thus alienated from material unity, non-representational effect functions to effectuate non-representational material becoming, new horizons for biopsychic and technoscientific evolution. Having actualized the body as an effective hyperstitional technology, the anti-representational immanence of the cyber-feminist program codifies the immanent continuity between epistemology and ontology, whereby the infinite potentialities of nature are expressed as effects, perceptions, and concepts constituting lived experience as such. Through the continuous deterritorializations of rhizomatic decentralization, cyberfeminism effectively destabilized the patriarchal codification of women, technology, and nature as passive things to be dominated and controlled, establishing instead an open hyperstition of material indeterminacy. The open hyperstition is a performance of anonymous reflexivity, accelerating indeterminate effective responses as immediate reality production through open-source aestheticological mechanics. Advanced to 2015. And the Cyber-Feminist Foundation has been implemented in the alienist post-humanism of xenofeminism. Invoked as a collective manifestation by the group Laboria Bubonics, xenofeminism is not a unified control program, but instead an assemblage of intersectional politics without the infection of purity. What xenofeminism is, becomes through the contextualization of its performance, It effectuates an exercise in hyperstition which navigates the complexified socio-political dynamics of contemporary civilization, with an awareness that the future cannot be colonized by a singular program. Rather than plotting a generalized representation of a future necessarily divorced from the incredible nuance of both subjective experience and parallel feminist politics, xenofeminism speaks as no one in particular, staging ontological alienation as a productive state necessary for the development and proliferation of new forms and practices. In order to facilitate a complex network of effective revelations, Laboria Cubonics manifested a five-dimensional hyperobject in the material world, the Xenofeminist Manifesto. This manifesto is an actualized virtual network, a self-contained open hyperstition operating by and in the same fluid mechanics as cyberspace and material reality. Though each section and passage in the manifesto contains its own idea, there is no objective path by which to navigate the text. Entries can be engaged in themselves or folded into nonlinear feedback loops produced through non-hierarchical flux and indeterminate continuities. Each claim is ampliative or revisable as a hypertextual subject. The manifesto's cut-up and fold-in communication system performs as a mathematico-geometric architecture of reasoning that orders thoughts as sequences and vectors. There is no wrong way to engage the text, only a legion of right ways. With and as this manifesto of rhizomatic vector propagation becomes an invitation to reverse ascribe material reality productions which experiment with and through the indeterminacies of gender and sexuality is non-essential. Material production then becomes as networked communication with the fluidity of non-representation, and as such the alienated nuance of identity, queer, gender, and sexual politics. From the metapolitical performances of post-CCIU culture manifest narrative sequences for collective invocations of will. The utilization of communication networks for global actualization feedback has gained traction as a represented mode of effective intervention. Though located within a disenchanted reality matrix, the heirs of the CCIU's aesthetaphysical untradition have utilized creative logic to manifest postmodern methods and modes for indirect reality manipulation, both accultural and technoscientific. Integral to the aesthetaphysical operations of accelerationism performed by both the left and far right, is the engagement of time as complex network of rhizomatic becoming. In the wake of postmodern theory, quantum mechanics, chaos theory, and Internet technology, a unified time progressing as a fixed linearity can no longer represent the multiplicity of becoming which actualizes temporal flow. As such, the manipulation of time must also become through multiplicity. A singular will is thus insufficient to plot a future vector, and more so incapable of actualizing itself forward given the complexified communication maintained throughout society and by dominant control programs. Though a singular will is insufficient for infectious change, a swarm is effective, hyperstitional technology which incites a swarm of collective intelligence, sustaining positive feedback between ideas through a decentralized time flow, maintains the capacity to invoke a multiplicity of future productions which transversely represent local and global non-representation. Warp. Swarm dynamics. Functioning to dismantle and overlap rigid intellectual binaries such as art and scholarship, fiction and fact, orimic and itic. An aim of this thesis was to deterritorialize traditional limits imposed upon academic research. As a postmodern experiment in and of performance philosophy, Time Circuit has manifested aesthetaphysical theory through itself as a contemporary academic methodology, historical component of 20th century occultism, and an effective, untradition entangling art, magic, and philosophy. By doing aesthetaphysics to explain aesthetaphysics, this work maintained an experimental thesis by which the research question was an exercise in dynamic multiplicity. A concise and unified explanation for a specific question and topic was neither the foundation nor the intended outcome of the above work. Instead, active research conducted as a dynamic performance facilitated an academic approach which sought to experiment with the decentralization and complexification of organized fields, disciplines, and approaches to create and engage a deterritorialized semiotic flow. By decentralizing and aestheticizing the research space, The academic materials under analysis became as creative components, further developing themselves and the performance of the theory being performed. This creative engagement was then networked as feedback across and within the performance, such that each section to some degree explained the other sections while also explaining themselves with, as, and through an aesthetaphysical lens. The engaged utilization of 20th century occultism and postmodern philosophy in and as this performance then functioned to actualize and demonstrate the artistic capacity of and between the topical components, blurring the distinctions dividing scholarship, art practice, and disenchanted magic. The semiotic flow which became as and through the research performance functioned not only to map a postmodern complex of onto temporal aesthetics across 20th century occultism, but also to mobilize said complex as a contemporary phenomenon, utilizing the performative historical presence as a source for innovation to further engage the past as something new. In doing so, the thinkers, theories, events, and objects discussed were engaged and explained by and as a utilization of creative logic consistent with the ontological parameters of disenchanted representation, opening up the entirety of the complexified communication network as a source for further utilization and development. As such, aesthetaphysics as a theory gained representational traction historically and philosophically to creatively engage and connect concepts and discourses formerly alienated through tradition and discipline. Though only an initial engagement with the adaptive scope of aesthetaphysical theory, the experimental performance research carried out in this work has given way to numerous aesthetic concepts, including hyperstitional esotericism, accultural accelerationism, and hyperoccultation. Drawing from the rhizomatic onto aesthetics for time and reality manipulation explicated by hyperstition and accelerationism, the concept of hyperoccultation has been presented as a postmodern and anti-dialectic phenomenon active within disenchanted semiotics. With an emphasis on nonlinear network communications, hyperoccultation demonstrates the effective utilization of immaterial causality as a multi-purpose method and practice. Hyperoccultation is not an alternative paradigm reacting to and resisting disenchantment as a re-enchantment, rather it is a creative approach to reality development. Hyperoccultation thus opens spaces for inter- and interdisciplinary experimentation within active academic discourses, art practice, historical research, and socio-political theory. Furthermore, hyperoccultation works to perform and entangle disenchantment discourse with and as the socio-political discourses of post-humanism, new materialism, and late capitalism, integrating Western esotericism beyond its regulated academic territory and accelerating historical research as contemporary scholarship. The feedback produced within this work between Western esotericism and accelerationist theory demonstrates the relevance and applicability of rejected knowledge within contemporary culture. Groups, individuals, practices, theories, and even objects who have been alienated by or from dominant narrative sequences maintain the multitemporal capacity to locate lost futures and accelerate alien lines of flight. Working from the limited selection of currents and practices presented in this work alone gives way to a vast array of topics to infect, deterritorialize, and perform by and as each other. The works of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari perform such that they can be employed as plague vectors within fixed territories and as such may provide new insight into contemporary discussions, one example being religious experience and altered states of consciousness. Aleister Crowley and H.P. Lovecraft both demonstrate hyperstitional practices in themselves and also hypertextual traction for engagements with queer theory, while Antonin Artaud's experimental art theory can be engaged and developed as a lens to blend ritual and contemporary performance by effective becoming. Chaos Magic also provides a dynamic theoretical approach to literary and art criticism, utilizing unbelief for a postmodern reading of texts and artworks as five-dimensional hyper-objects circulating internal performative mechanics and realities whilst also emitting causal feedback in the material world. Furthermore, the independent works of Sadie Plant which already perform interdisciplinary and multitemporal experimentation in themselves provide theoretical, conceptual, and historical content which can be cross-networked with religious, anthropological, and cultural studies on technology, drugs, and avant-garde art. The performative creative spaces opened by aesthetaphysics are theoretically unbound, and this brief presentation of ideas encapsulates only a small portion of potential topics, let alone aesthetic enactments, by which it can be utilized. By engaging reality as art by artistic means, the codifications of time, order, society, and identity give way to the rhizomatic becoming of a dynamic non-representational multiplicity. The limit for representation is thus established by what it is not yet, open to active expansion through integration and engagement. As an academic methodology, aesthetaphysics provides an open-source network for interdisciplinary engagement. Rigid, fixed, or stagnant disciplines can expand their territories through engagement with and as a plurality of narratives, focusing not on truth, but representational presence and unrecognized potential. Establishing tractions for non-represented reality components to aesthetically become as effective vectors across academia thus functions to continuously develop reality by means other than those established by tradition, empirical methods, or objectivity. Manifestation becomes through naming, and as such the conjuration of non-representational elements into semiotic flow is only limited by ascriptive invocation, incursions of the outside within,